Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little darker than our usual tales. The disturbing reality of life in a medieval asylum. Forget the candle-lit infirmaries and kindly clerics of storybooks. Behind stone walls there were crowded wards, superstition-led treatments, and a thin line between care and containment. The truth is, if you were dropped into one of those rooms this very night, surviving until dawn would be its own ordeal. The cold, the odours, the crude methods, and the constant watchfulness would wear anyone down. If you're enjoying this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the variety of places people are watching from. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Madness in the medieval mind arrived not as a single thing, but as a chorus of explanations, each voice earnest, loud, and convinced that it held the right lamp. Theology named it sin and possession, medicine named it imbalance, law named it danger to order and property. The three spoke across one another in parish churches, in the cloisters of Salerno and Toledo, at council tables, and in bedside rooms where feverish bodies lay beneath rushes, and their combined verdict shaped how entire communities decided to shut a person away. This was not an idea in a book. It was an everyday logistics problem. Who would take responsibility for a person who no longer answered the household bell or who began to throw stones at the altar? Who would watch them at night? Who would pay? Those hard, practical questions were answered from three shelves of thought: scripture and sermon, the books of Hippocrates and Galen as mediated by Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Maimonides, and the parchments of municipal and ecclesiastical law. And together they produced a machinery for identifying, segregating, and sometimes tending the mad. Medicine carried its own pedigree into those decisions. The humoral theory inherited from Hippocrates and reworked by Galen was not a quaint folk idea, but the organising principle of medieval physiology. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic, these were the four rivers that irrigated the body and the mind. If one rose or shrank, behaviour changed. Black bile, melancholia, became the classic explanation for what we might call depression, and for many kinds of withdrawal and visionary behaviour. Choler, hot and puttering, explained rage and fits of fury. The Arabic medical corpus, translated in the 12th century translation movement in Toledo by figures such as Gerard of Cremona, brought Avicenna's canon into Latin Europe, where its chapters on melancholia and mania became textbooks in the universities of Paris and Montpellier. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, the popular Salernitan handbook, circulated maxims that a physician could fan into practice, regulate diet, purge and vomit when the humours were foul, bleed to rebalance and adjust the environment. Physicians such as John of Gaddesden in England, writing in the early 14th century, prescribed measures familiar to their predecessors: emetics, cupping, opiates, and the careful use of music and flowers to temper spirits. Medicine offered techniques and logistics, a regimen, a diet, a prescription of space and time, and above all a pragmatic idea of containment: keep the patient warm, keep the humours quiet, avoid stimulation. That translated into practical instructions: move the bed near a window for fresh air, isolate a person during a fever, or apply a poultice to calm tremors. It meant that hospitals and infirmaries had to be arranged, because care required room, straw, ale, a fireplace, and someone to administer draughts and poultices. Theology sat beside medicine, and both were read through law. Scripture and patristic thought supplied a vocabulary that could name the experience as moral failure or spiritual assault. Augustine and the Desert Fathers were haunting presences. Evagrius Ponticus and John Cassian had set down the monastic catalogue of the passions, among them acedia, that dull, corrosive apathy that could look very much like melancholy. Bernard of Clairvaux, in his sermons of the 12th century, mapped spiritual maladies onto social life, warning monks and laity alike that disordered will could befall anyone. Ecclesiastical manuals and penitentials listed sins, prescribed penance, and described the remedies the Church could apply: prayer, fasting, exorcism. Bishops' registers from the later Middle Ages brim with orders for exorcisms recorded as routine pastoral work. The Pontificale Romanum contained rites for exorcism, and priests were expected to stand between God and the demon, to read the right words and to administer the right water. The diagnosis was moral and metaphysical as much as physical. An out-of-control temper might be bile. A trance-like ecstasy might be an invitation from God. Involuntary convulsions might be demonic. Theology did not always cut against medicine. It often worked with it. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, gave scholastic form to distinctions that mattered practically, differentiating voluntary and involuntary action, considering whether a person had the capacity for moral agency, and his categories were used by ecclesiastical judges who had to decide whether someone could be punished for a crime or needed pastoral care. The same hand that sent a man to a confessor might also advise his family to bring in a physician. These mental maps of causation had cultural mirrors. Poetry and chronicles offered a language for madness that was at once metaphorical and literal. Troubadours of 12th and 13th century Occitania spun the trope of amorous madness, folia d'amour, a celebrated and often courtly form of loss of reason, while in vernacular religious works, visions and raptures could be read as either sanctity or sickness. William Langland's Piers Plowman, composed in the later 14th century, and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, late 14th century, used images of frenzy and foolishness to moral effect, to satirise, to warn, to instruct, which in turn influenced how parish communities perceived certain behaviours. At the same time, the chronicles that record kings and nobles made madness political. Charles VI of the France, born in 1368, began to suffer grave attacks in the 1390s. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart caught the bewilderment of courts where a king's lunacy altered alliances and turned regents into battlegrounds. When a monarch collapsed into one of those fits, sometimes catatonic, at other times violent, the matter was no longer merely pastoral care but a state crisis. Regiments had to be arranged, guardians put in place, property and office secured. In England, the later bouts of Henry VI in the mid-15th century show the same collision of medicine, piety and political logistics. A court that had to feed, clothe, guard and also govern a sovereign who could not govern himself. The stakes were enormous. Madness here was not a private inconvenience, it was a problem of administration. From those intellectual frames emerged places for containment, not a single kind of house, but an archipelago of spaces with different aims and architecture. Monastic infirmaries were an obvious first port. Cluniac and Benedictine houses in the 11th and 12th centuries expanded infirmaries to care for monks, pilgrims, and sometimes local laity, with Cluny itself developing a large medical quarter to tend the thousands who passed through its gates. These were lit by small windows tended by infirmarians and lay brothers, and underwritten by the laboratory of prayer. Care was both spiritual and physical. The Hospitaller orders, founded in the early 12th century, the Knights of St. John and later the Sisters and Brothers of St. Lazarus, ran hospitals for pilgrims and the sick in Jerusalem, Rhodes and across Europe. The Order of St. Lazarus in particular, associated with leprosaria, also became a repository for those the community wished to separate from the main flows of life. In towns, charitable houses multiplied. St. Bartholomew's in London, founded by Roher about 1123, grew into an urban hospital. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, a far older foundation reaching back into the early medieval period by the 12th century, had been restructured into a significant institution with rules and a charter. The Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, established by the Royal Charter in 1247, would over the centuries be one of the places where the mentally disturbed might find themselves, later earning the ruefully shortened name Bedlam. Florence gives us another model. Santa Maria Nuova, opened near the end of the 13th century in 1288, stood as an urban response to sickness and destitution and shows how cities built institutions to confront the practical question of who to shelter. These houses were not all one in purpose. A monastery's infirmary aimed, nominally, piously, at bodily cure and the salvation of a soul. A leper hospital was a quarantine, its design dictated by desire to keep disease, and those associated with it at a distance. Municipal almshouses and brotherhood hospitals took in the poor and infirm as a matter of civic responsibility, and their charters often record donors who endowed a bed for the poor and a priest to pray for the donor's soul. The distinction mattered. A bed given in perpetuity by the will of a merchant came with precise obligations: bread at vespers, a candle at matins, a chantry mass, and that made the bed functionally different from a space set aside by a guild to hide or hideously corral a troublesome member. Some houses, when the demand for isolation rose, repurposed charity beds into confinement spaces. Others, civic hospitals in Bruges or Ghent, The Godschwiesen, or houses of God of the Low Countries, wrapped economic logic into their care. Endowments, rents from urban properties, and the management of lands allowed certain institutions to operate on a scale that could, in principle, hold a number of marginal people without immediate profit. Yet the ledger always had the last word. Account rolls, cartularies, and hospital charters reveal the arithmetic of care. Stipends for bread, payments for straw and ale, wages for a keeper, and in several municipal rolls the recorded payments for the keeping of a pauper or idiot. One line in a register tells you that beneath the spiritual canopy there was clerical arithmetic. To care for the mad in any sustained way required reliable income, and where that dried up the institution's mission could be narrow, quarantine, correction, or even a thinly disguised method of dealing with those who embarrassed property owners. By the later Middle Ages, a market, a grim one, for private keepers had also developed. Families who could not cope, or who feared a scandal, sometimes contracted with keepers who specialised in the management of the unquiet household member. The keeper was at once a nurse, a jailer, and a business ledger. He provided a room, food, a strap, or sometimes a chain, and a promise to shield families from nocturnal disturbances. He invoiced them. City account books show payments to such men, and chancery petitions later record disputes when a keeper refused to return an estate's keys or charged for much more than the board. The private keeper met a social need, the desire for discretion, and converted it into revenue. Where charitable models depended on fixed benefactions and the slow accrual of gifts, private keeping was immediate and volatile, a pay-as-you-go solution that could easily become predatory. If you step inside one of these institutions as a visitor of the imagination, what you register are logistics: beds staggered in dim halls, a range of smells, herbs, stale ale, smoke, sometimes the more bitter stench of old wounds, the low ache of a hearth in winter, and the constant tallying of the day's provisions. A hospital ledger might note 5 loaves, 10 measures of ale, a half-yard of cloth, and the wage for one man to tend the insane. That is the rhythm of care translated into numbers. Inventories, the lists written when an abbot or hospital master died, or when a house was reformed, and tell us about rooms, a guest's hall, an infirmary with a curtain, a small cell for the violent, a locked chest for medicines. Charters sometimes specify duties. 1 bed for the poor to be kept in the infirmary. The master shall ensure its maintenance and the singing of a mass each year for the donor. The charters also reveal priorities. Houses whose founders were worried about contagion built separate huts for lepers, and by extension sometimes used them as places to place those who were feared. The architecture and the paper trail make clear that medieval containment was rarely a single policy. It was an ensemble of practices adapted to local needs and the economic means to meet them. This ensemble of practices had to be fed with a social and legal process. Admission. There was no single ritual for sending someone away. Often it began quietly with a family petition. A household weary of a kin who had become violent or disoriented sometimes preferred a stable solution, and family members, the mother, a brother, a spouse, went to the parish priest or the local magistrate and said the words that mattered. He is no longer of sound mind. She has visions that frighten the neighbours. The parish priest, learned in penance and exorcistic rites, might perform a preliminary inquiry. He could recommend prayer and fasting. He could, when he feared something more, summon a physician. When clergy and medicine agreed that the person posed a public risk, the matter might pass to the ecclesiastical judge or to the civic officials, the mayor and alderman in an English borough, the consuls in an Italian commune, the baileys in a French town. These authorities had the power to order removal and to appoint a custodian. In some towns, mayoral registers show entries that are bureaucratically precise. An order for one man named X to take into custody the woman Y, whose habit of wandering has become a public nuisance, and to keep her at the hospital until further notice. That sentence hides an entire logistical chain: transport, bedding, payment to the keeper, and the drawing up of a bond by the family so that the keeper would not steal property. When the case touched property, the feudal machinery could also come into force. Under feudal custom, a lord's wardship might be invoked when the tenant could no longer manage lands. The lord would claim custody for the sake of the estate, appoint a guardian, and demand financial sureties. Thus the same phenomenon, a person incapacitated, could be simultaneously a pastoral problem, a medical one, and a fiscal one. There were inevitably more drastic instruments. Ecclesiastical registers are not shy of exorcism orders, and for certain behaviours bishops did not hesitate to issue formal injunctions, to remove a person from the parish, to restrict their visits, to require them to live under the watch of a named keeper. In cities there were civic decrees that made wandering and disruptive behaviour offences, and magistrates could consign the offender to the city hospital or to a private keeper. The legal world also wrestled with the problem of feigned madness. People could claim to be possessed to evade obligations, or could be accused of faking to escape punishment. Courts were suspicious. This suspicion produced procedures, inquiries, witness testimony, often an oath. Is this person of sound mind? And the appointment of guardians when judges decided they were not. The skeletal legal language that deals with non compos mentis has roots in Roman law's Furiosus and in medieval canonical developments such as Gratian's Decretum, which shaped the Church's approach to mental incapacity. Over time, practical instruments hardened. The need to manage estates, to file an inventory, to post bonds, to appoint guardians, to register the custody of a person. Such paperwork became the scaffolding within which fate was decided. Imagine a petition drawn in a chancery scriptorium. The ink is still damp, the clerk's hand steady. The petitioner is a son who writes, with the help of a scribe, of his father's sudden unquiet, and of the danger that his late father's affairs be dissipated. He asks the king's court or the local bailiff to declare the father incapable, and to appoint guardians to oversee the lands until the mind is restored, or the king's peace otherwise provided for. The court sends commissioners to make a sworn inquest. Neighbours, the parish priest, the village smith, each swears to the truth. An entry in a manorial roll documents the finding. X has been found of unsound mind and incapable of managing his affairs. The inventory is drawn, the goods are sealed, a guardian is appointed, and posts a bond. The language is legal and almost bureaucratic, but the human moment in the room before the scribe is not. There is the son's relief, the father's bewilderment, the neighbour's fatigue. For the person declared unfit, the immediate consequence often meant removal from the household, the place of their life, to some other roof. Monastic infirmary, a hospital, the lodging of a keeper. Rights were precarious at each stage. Medieval law did provide avenues for appeal and for redress, pleas to church courts, petitions to the king's chancery, suits against greedy guardians, but those routes required knowledge, money and time. They were often, in the end, instruments the well-off could sometimes use and the poor could not. The precariousness of patients' rights is visible when we look at contested cases in municipal and royal archives. A woman might write to the bishop to complain that her brother had been seized by a keeper, who then refused to return the family cattle. A merchant might petition the chancery that his ward had been mismanaged by a guardian appointed by a local magistrate. The paper chase reveals how vulnerable persons judged insane were to exploitation. There are also instances, recorded in chronicles and registers, where neighbours colluded in confinement for reasons of property or reputation. The law sometimes caught up and reversed a decision. Sometimes it did not. Social power, status, wealth, the weight of a family name shaped the outcome at every step. The rule of law was there. Its application was human and uneven. Scale is another angle that changes the picture. The institutions described above were not single cottages, but networks. A single cathedral city might have several hospitals, a consular hospital, monastic infirmaries, and a scattering of leper houses, all connected by charters, gifts, and the movement of goods. The Black Death of the mid-14th century, which emptied parishes and left many without kin, also strained the capacity of hospitals and sharpened the problem of those left wandering in towns with no obvious place to go. Plague years multiplied the numbers of the destitute and made municipal authorities more assertive about removing masterless folk, a category that sometimes swallowed the wandering mentally disturbed. As endowments dwindled and populations shifted, municipal officials became more pragmatic, and sometimes harder, in their dispositions, preferring removal to an encumbering long-term commitment. Caring for the mad was therefore a matter of budgets and logistics, allocating a bed in a ward for a month, deciding whether a single hospital had the medical personnel to administer tempering draughts for melancholy, ensuring enough straw for the winter. It is worth cataloguing the small human details that turn the abstract problem of madness into the day-to-day work of containment. Keepers needed rooms, hospitals needed beds and a steady supply of food. Physicians needed apothecaries stocked with herbs and opiates. Clergy needed chaplains to pray beside the bedside. Magistrates needed witnesses to swear to a person's condition. Charities needed donors who specified goods in their wills. These are rows in inventories, the accounting of a recipe for maintaining a fragile civil order in which people who did not fit, who could not be made to fit, were contained. The paperwork mattered. A donor's bequest for one bed for the poor might be revoked or repurposed if a hospital's master received pressure from city officials. The tangled legal, clerical and fiscal networks thus formed a lattice within which individual lives were caught and sometimes cared for, sometimes hidden away, sometimes profited from. And here the human irony of the medieval asylum emerges in a softer, darker laugh. Theology could dignify the afflicted as souls that required prayer and penance. Medicine could dignify them as patients with humours that required treatment. Law could dignify them as wards of the Lord or the crown whose estates required protection. Dignity, however, is not the same as security. The patient might be honoured by a chantry mass and still be held in a room with a keeper who charged until the pence ran out. The charters and the sermons, the prescriptions and the inquests, all tried to translate a moral and medical problem into procedures and spaces. They succeeded unevenly. Sometimes the bed in the infirmary saved a life. Sometimes the same bed was used to isolate an embarrassment. Sometimes a bishop's letter of exoneration restored a woman's reputation. Sometimes it led to her being kept out of town. The medieval answer was therefore pragmatic and patchwork, built by monks and magistrates, physicians and families, stitched with vows and bonds. If you imagine a night when a removal was about to take place, picture the quiet choreography. A neighbour knocks at the chamber door. A small knot of people gathers in the lane. A constable carries a lantern. The household that has been on edge for weeks steadies itself and signs a bond. The keeper arrives with a cloak and a chest for medicines. The priest mutters a prayer. The physician has written a short note on remedies. The person in question is wrapped, perhaps persuaded, perhaps not, and carried away. The town's accounting clerk will make an entry the next day, payment to the keeper, cost of one bed in the infirmary, and the scribe's hand will reach back to the stewardship that ensures the bed receives bread and incense and, in a year, the annual mass for the departed donor. It is as bureaucratic as it is human. It is a system of small repeated acts, orders issued, notices carried, bonds signed, beds filled, medicines measured. These acts built the medieval asylum in all its varieties. Look at this not as an isolated cruelty, but as the visible outcome of three disciplines trying to do a practical thing, to reconcile the spiritual, medical, and legal demands that a person no longer living within the accepted bounds of reason presented. The medieval mind could hold many contradictory truths at once. A saint and a madman might be the same person. A demoniac could be the melancholic patient. Safeguarding an estate could protect a vulnerable life or profit a keeper. Logistics, rooms, beds, apothecary stores, charters, bonds, turned theory into practice. Theology told communities why they should care. Medicine told them how. Law told them who should pay and who should be in custody. The result was an apparatus complicated and often blunt, humane and sometimes merciless, calibrated to a world where networks of care had to be assembled with the resources at hand. And so the medieval asylum was not a single image, but a set of continuities and compromises. Monasteries that cared and prayed, leper houses that quarantined, municipal hospitals that served as catch-all shelters, private keepers who turned discretion into commerce, and courts that parcelled property and person. The machinery was slow and local. It operated by parish and charter, by the sound of a bell and the seal of a governor. It was, in the end, as human as the people who ran it. Small clerks recording bread, pious donors, shandan specifying candles, keepers counting fees, priests praying late into the night, physicians measuring humours. If the modern mind thinks of rites and professions and institutions as fixed, the medieval view was different. It was improvisatory, incremental, constrained by theology and theory, and powered by the simple arithmetic of soup, straw and ink. That arithmetic decided who would be watched, where they would sleep, who would hold their land, and how, in that slow candlelit way, communities chose to shut someone up and to call it care. Stone breathes slowly in these stories, and when you stand before the grey faces of medieval hospitals and asylums, you can almost hear that breathing, the long, habitual in and out that shaped life inside. Imagine arriving at the gate of a 12th or 13th century hospital in England or France. The wooden portcullis creaks, a gatekeeper's lantern throws a thin circle of light, and beyond the courtyard the mass of the building rises, its walls crammed with rooms, its roofs patched with tile or thatch. In London, the Priory of St Mary of Bethlehem, founded in 1247 and later remembered as Bethlem, occupied cramped urban plots where every spare yard counted. In Spitalfields, the Hospital of St Mary Spital, begun around 1197, spread out as a complex of halls and lodgings. In Rome, the huge Ospedale di Santo Spirito held court in convoluted wings built across centuries. And in Salerno and Padua, the clinics and teaching wards of the medieval Schola Medica clustered around cloisters and chapels. Across Christendom, similar arrangements, chapels, dormitories, refectories, kitchens, latrines, folded together in patterns both practical and punitive. In the Islamic world, too, the Bimaristans of Baghdad and Damascus, those great houses of healing, founded and expanded from the 9th century onward, presented another model, purpose-built wards, separate baths and libraries where physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina read and argued about minds and humours. The buildings mattered. They were maps of power and care, and they told you immediately what life would feel like. Walk with me through a typical complex, imagined from plans, measured surveys and CGI reconstructions that modern historians and museums stitch together from fragments. First, the outer shell. Massive stone walls a yard thick in places, pierced by small high windows. Glass is a rarity until late medieval times. Instead, shutters, wooden lattices, or translucent horn let a pale light through. The roof trusses sit like ribs above a maze of low-ceilinged corridors. Smoke stains the beams, and in winter cold cuts through the joints. The chief wards are usually long rooms, the infirmary and the common hall, organised like ship's berths. In a larger institution, one ward might be for men, another for women. Others segregate lepers, the crippled, or those described in the records as miserables or mad. The central chapel, often at the heart of the complex, prescribes rhythm. Its bells call the hours and call the inmates back into a communal economy of prayer that the rule of Saint Benedict and its later hospital offshoots insisted upon. The chapel is both sanctuary and control room. Anyone who has seen a medieval plan will notice how wards radiate around it, as if liturgy were the hub of governance. But the wards are not airy sanctuaries. They are long, narrow boxes of sound and smell. Imagine a CGI cross-section that opens like a dollhouse. You pass a latrine built over a shallow pit, then a kitchen where a scullery maid stokes the fire, and then you turn into the ward. The floor is packed earth or roughly hewn flagstones, uneven and cold. The beds are benches shoved against the wall, or straw mattresses laid upon wooden pallets, and often they are mere square spaces partitioned with low screens. In smaller hospitals and in the earliest asylums there are single cells, stone cubes with slit windows and iron bars. These are not philosophical cells designed for contemplation. They are utilitarian boxes where the sick, the poor and the disturbed are kept out of the way. Look closely at archaeological evidence from medieval hospital sites in London and Paris. You find post holes for bolt-locked doors, fragments of shackles and iron hinges, and concentrations of bones and rubbish in refuse pits that tell of heavy use and neglect. Documentary plans from the 14th and 15th centuries show kitchen hearths and buttery stores stacked against the external walls so that heat rose into inhabited rooms, but not enough to banish winter chills. Sound is one of the first things to strike you in a reconstruction. In the CGI renderings made from actual plans, the long ward becomes a resonant box where coughing amplifies, where moans ricochet, where the clank of chains and the scrape of a chair are audible across the length of the room. The chapel bell provides punctuating notes, but otherwise noise is a steady background. Carts rattling in the courtyard, the sharp commands of stewards, the clatter of kitchenware, and sometimes the bark of dogs kept to chase vermin. Animal sounds fill those spaces because animals are part of the provision economy. Geese and hags are fattened on hospital waste, and sometimes a small menagerie is tolerated for warmth or even therapy. Smell is the quality most easily lost in dry plans, but in a true reconstruction it is unavoidable. The kitchens throw up a complex collage: wood smoke, boiled porridge, sour curds, stale ale. The latrines and the open drains carry a permanent stink of human waste and rotting food. Linen, when it exists, is seldom fresh. Straw bedding is damp and smells of urine. Herbs hung in corridors attempt to mask the reek. Medieval sources mention hyssop, rosemary and lavender, used to scent rooms, and indeed apothecary lists in hospital inventories include bundles of aromatic plants. But these are small gestures against the olfactory force of hundreds of bodies living close together. Spatial hierarchy, the way rooms are organised and who has access, is the other story architecture tells. In the larger chalice-shaped hospitals like Santo Spirito, there are private chambers for benefactors and separate infirmaries for those with means. In smaller municipal institutions, the wealthy sometimes had small beds near the windows while the poor were piled in the centre under the eaves. In Bethlehem's early configurations, the authority of the prior and the almoner is clear. Small clerical rooms and a chapel take the prime positions, while the ward becomes a vast multi-use space often pressed up against alleyways and neighbouring tenements. In Islamic Bimaristans, by contrast, records and his surviving plans suggest deliberate separation and specialised rooms. Baths integral to treatment, lecture rooms for physicians, libraries, and even pavilions for the mentally ill with access to gardens. The Bimaristan of Damascus in the 12th century, for instance, is described in chroniclers' accounts as having separate wards for different diseases and spaces where music and conversation were encouraged as therapy. That contrast is not moralistic, it is logistical. Building form prescribes treatment possibilities. If you have a bathhouse attached to your ward, you will bathe the mad. If your ward opens onto a cloister garden, you will walk certain patients there as a form of therapy by exercise. If you have only one long noisy hall, the only treatment will be regulation and confinement. The architecture also enforces hierarchy through sightlines and movement. The almoner and the senior nurse, often lay staff in medieval hospitals, control stores and the kitchen, so they set daily ration sizes and what herbal preparations are given. Records from hospital ledgers in Florence and London indicate that food distribution is carefully recorded, quantities of bread, beer, cheese and the occasional meat. The narrowness of the service passages, the location of the pantry and the communal refectory are practical measures to prevent theft and to monitor who eats what. It is architecture turned into surveillance. In some municipal asylums chronicled in city records, the cells are deliberately inward-facing, with high walls and no view. The idea is to keep troublesome sightlines from the street. In monasteries and religious hospitals where charity and sanctuary were intertwined, the cloister provides a buffer, a rhythm of movement around a garden. But buffers can also become traps. When a plague hits, when winter deepens, when the institutional budget shrinks, the same cloister that once provided air and light can become a pen. For those incarcerated within, one of the most intimate experiences is how the building turned temperature, smell and touch into instruments of a life measured out in small humiliations. Cold penetrates through unglazed windows and thin doors. The poor burn everything they can to warm themselves. Rushes on the floor, scraps of wood, old clothes. In wet seasons, the straw bedding becomes a slick, decomposing mass. The walls, thick with lime wash, absorb moisture and give back a dampness that chills the nightly hours. The sensory world inside is amplified by communal living. Privacy is rare, and bodily functions are public. Latrines are usually a shared, unpleasant theatre. Even when a hospital has a better latrine system, a garderobe with a channeled drain into the local stream, that system is a narrow concession. Smells still waft, infections still pass along. What of the corners where chains appear? Archaeological finds and legal records give us fragments. Iron rings, short shackles, descriptions in court rolls of manacles, used in the care of violent patients. Masters of certain hospitals wrote inventories listing irons, stakes and strapping devices as part of their equipment, a dismal line item alongside spices and garlic. In the absence of professional psychiatric knowledge, physical restraint functioned as a means of control and, often, as a public reassurance to visitors that the institution maintained order. In the wards, chained corners and locked cells are a spatial language. They say to the community, "We contain." They say to the inmate, "You are outside the usual moral economy." But restraint was not the only method. Isolation, humiliation, diet and regulated activity were equally architectural. A thin mattress in a narrow cubicle is itself a tool of correction. So too is the stubborn absence of heat. Move now along the slow clock of a day inside these buildings, and you approach the regimen that ordered life, prayer, labour, and an official choreography of routine that looks tidy on paper and frays at the edges in practice. The rule of St. Benedict and similar ecclesiastical guidelines set out canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. In hospitals attached to monasteries, the bells pull patients and staff into that rhythm. Chaplains read the hours and the psalms. The sick are expected, ideally, to join. The daily schedule on a 15th century hospital ledger looks neat. 5 a.m, matins, 7 a.m. breakfast, 8 to 11 work, noon prayers, simple midday meal, afternoon work, 6 p.m. vespers, and a curfew. It sounds regimented, and in many senses it is. The regimen serves the twin purposes of sanctification and control. Prayer is not merely devotion, but also a device to shape the day. For the institutionalized, participation in prayer offers a continuity of routine, a language to understand time when all other signals are chaotic. Yet the reality is messier. A typical hospital body is not composed solely of the devout or the obedient. Municipal hospitals take in drunkards, the insane, beggars, the chronically ill, the exhausted. Many patients resist. The work prescribed is variable. In some places, labour is therapeutic. In the Hospital of the Holy Spirit in Rome, records show that patients could be set to simple tasks: sewing, spinning, mending clothes, tending gardens, that both supplied the institution and kept bodies moving. In Florence and Siena, confraternity hospitals sometimes hired the able-bodied among the sick to weave bands or roll candles, productive labour that offset costs. In other institutions, especially before the rise of professional nursing, the idle sat in unending waiting, flicking at the straw, watching the bell rope sway. Boredom becomes a form of suffering, and this is where daily life reveals its cruelty in administrative rather than physical terms. Monastic rules assume a community of workers and prayers. Municipal realities create an excess of mouths and a shortage of work. Food distribution is a logistical problem central to the rhythm of the day. Medieval kitchen ledgers record quantities that historians can translate into daily rations. Bread is the staple. Ale or thin beer is the usual beverage because water is suspect. Meat is rare, often reserved for the feast days that hospital patrons fund. Fasting rules complicate diets. On certain days there is fish or thin pottage. On others there is more substantial fare. For those labelled mad, diet can be prescribed as therapy: bland foods to quiet the imagination, or strong wines to restore spirits, depending on which physician's advice is followed. Food economy is a place where charity, religion, and municipal budgets knot together. The kindly donor who endows a hospital for the poor and the insane rarely specifies exactly how the insane should be fed, and the institutional managers improvise. In many inventories you find a humiliating mixture of generosity and neglect, a yearly donation of 10 loaves, a barrel of salt fish, and an instruction that prisoners, lunatics, and the aged are entitled to a share. Discipline and punishment live within the daily regimen as routine instruments. Corporal punishment, the birch, public beating or enforced penance, appears in municipal records as a method to correct disruptive behaviour. But it is also wrapped in moral language: correction for disorder, penance for sin. In some late medieval town ordinances one reads that madmen who beat others should be bound and publicly whipped for their cure, a curious conflation of discipline and therapy. The line between a medical intervention and punishment is thin. Constraints like the straitjacket are rare in the early medieval period, but binding and fastening are common. Nurses and attendants use sheets, ropes, and wooden frames to prevent harm, and these methods are recorded with an almost bureaucratic indifference in hospital accounts. There is a grim domesticity about this. Restraint is as much about protecting the linen and the neighbour as it is about healing the individual. Resistance, too, takes forms both small and stubborn. Patients slip out of wards to beg in the streets. Some carve messages into beams. Others feign madness to escape work. The archive preserves folk ingenuity. A 15th century municipal plea might note a woman who had been discharged and then returned with stolen garments, pleading her right to shelter because of her poverty and mental state. Legal petitions sometimes record relatives suing for custody of a kin described as of unsound mind, and these lawsuits reveal a tug-of-war over responsibility and property. The institution is not a monolith, it is a theatre of negotiation. Occasional riot and escape are possible, but more commonly resistance is soft and quotidian. Refusal to go to chapel, secret hoarding of bread, the slow erosion of discipline when an overworked staff cannot maintain the daily liturgy. Interwoven with architecture and regimen is the medical logic that justified so many treatments, humoral theory. Medieval medicine sits atop an edifice of Hippocratic and Galenic principles transmitted through Arabic scholars and the schools of Salerno, Montpellier and Padua. The basic premise, known widely by the 13th century and codified by figures like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine became a staple, and later translated treatises, is that the body is governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and health depends on their balance. Madness, melancholy, mania are interpreted as humoral imbalances. Melancholy, for instance, is associated with excess black bile. Mania may be an excess of heat and dryness. The logical therapeutic response follows: bleed to remove excess blood, purge to evacuate the bowels, sweat to dispel phlegm, employ cold or hot baths depending on whether the patient is considered hot or cold within the humoral schema. Surgical manuals sit alongside recipe books in the hands of hospital staff. Guy de Chauliac's 14th century chirurgia, though later and more fully systematised, draws on older traditions and tells us what a medieval surgeon might attempt: tooth extraction, trepanation for head injuries and cauterisation. John of Arderne, an English surgeon of the 14th century, left practical instructions for treating violent wounds and abscesses, and in doing so he reveals how pragmatic and rough-handed much medical practice was. For mental conditions, however, the surgical repertoire is limited. The mainstays are medicinal and environmental: bloodletting with lancets and cupping glasses, purgatives, often unpleasant herbal decoctions, enemas and the use of baths and fomentations. Apothecary lists found in hospital ledgers read like the shopping list of a feverish household: rosemary, sage, hyssop, fennel, wormwood, hellebore, myrrh, saffron. Hellebore, especially white hellebore, veratrum, becomes notorious because it was used as a purgative supposed to draw humours away. Bitter tinctures and strong emetics aim to shock the body back into balance. The same repositories also keep floral and aromatic posies and syrups intended to calm. Mandrake, with its folkloric reputation for sedative properties, appears in the lists. So do confections of sugar and spices that serve both as medicine and confection. Bathing, both hot and cold, is a recurrent prescription. The Bimaristans attached bathhouses allow systematic use of water: hot baths to relax and sweat, cold baths to shock. In medieval European practice, baths are less consistently used, often due to practical constraints: fuel scarcity, the logistics of heating water for many bodies. Yet treatises recommend bathing as central to maintaining balance. The logic is simple: remove impurities, heat or cool the body, use the medium of water to carry away excess humours. That logic is coherent within the humoral framework, and sometimes it works. A warm fomentation can ease muscle tension, and an herbal soak can clean wounds. But the risks are real. Shared baths become vectors for infection. Wet bedding and cold after a bath worsen chills. The problem is systemic. Medieval therapeutics are based on an elaborate theory blended with folk practice. Practitioners had practical ingenuity, the apothecary's skill in compounding syrups and the surgeon's practical hand, but they also worked within a theoretical cul-de-sac that made some interventions paradoxically harmful. The coexistence of learned medicine and folk remedies creates an uneasy pluralism. Monastic infirmaries prize written authorities. The Canon, Galen, Hippocrates, the Salernitan school produces compendia like the Trotula for women's ailments. Constantine the African's translations bring Arabic pharmacology into Latin care. But in village wards, charlatans, wise women and herbalists practice alongside formally trained physicians. Domestic receipt books such as Le Ménagier de Paris, early 14th century, and household manuals list recipes: poultices of rue for calming, syrups of rose for sorrow, and onion compresses for headaches, that blur lines between domestic care and medical intervention. Surgical practice sits at the intersection. Trained barbers and itinerant surgeons perform bloodletting and tooth extraction. Monks with more education consult treatises. Apothecaries compile compendia of ingredients for the infirmary, and hospital inventories record the ready mixing of recipes into practical remedies. That mix breeds both creativity and danger. Some compounds are harmless or mildly effective, others are toxic. An overdose of hellebore can be fatal. The procedures of bleeding, if misapplied, weaken a patient further. There is a logistical dimension here that is crucial. Hospitals must keep inventories, maintain supplies, and prevent theft. The apothecary's cupboard is a logistical hub. When a plague or famine interrupts supply chains, the therapeutic menu narrows to what the house can produce: sagely potions, vinegar-based washes, or stale bread boiled into gruel. Behind the lists and prescriptions stands the question of the knowledge transfer. How did a remedy move from a physician's theory to an inmate's bedside? Often through ritualized performance. Bloodletting, for instance, is not merely a medical act but a practiced ritual. The tourniquet is tied, the lancet selected, sacred phrases sometimes uttered, and the blood collected. The tour becomes a public demonstration that something is being done. In some chronicled cases, a particularly notorious operator, a barber surgeon known for yielding to pressure from the family, executes a dramatic bleeding that assures onlookers more than it heals the patient. Likewise, the administration of cathartics and emetics is performed with care and ceremonial aliment. A cup presented, a spoon withdrawn, the bitter taste made into a sign of cure. These performances matter because institutions are social spaces as much as clinical ones. A procedure that proves to have medical efficacy and a visible ritual aspect confers credibility on those who perform it. Not all treatments are hands-on. Music, conversation, and the simple presence of attendants are deployed as therapies. The Islamic tradition, in particular, includes music therapy and occupational work in Bimaristans, described in surviving medical treatises and chroniclers' accounts. Al-Razi and later authors note the calming effects of measured singing and structured activity. Even in Europe, hospital life sometimes includes work therapy, spinning, weaving, candle making. This is not purely benevolent. It is labour organised to support the house, and it is also therapeutic by providing order and occupation. The modern notion of occupational therapy finds some of its remote antecedents here. When treatments fail, records become quieter, or the language shifts to administrative terms, further care deferred, discharged to the parish, or placed in the custody of kin. The administrative mundane absorbs failure. In late medieval municipal archives, one reads the cold economy of custody. Who pays for the inmate? Who signs the bond? What allowance is made? The bureaucracy handles suffering with ledgers and signatures, yet within those ledgers run personal tragedies hidden among granular entries that to the careful reader reveal an earnest attempt to manage limited resources in a world without systematic public mental health policy. Finally, consider the logistics of scale. A small hospital of 12 beds operates differently from a large municipal house responsible for hundreds. The larger the house, the more specialised the architecture must be. Separate kitchens, separate refectories, storerooms for grain, and fenced yards for animals. The larger the house, the greater the need for skilled administrators, and the more likely that the rules of discipline and medication will be formalised. Hospitals attached to universities, such as those in Padua or Montpellier, become centres of learning where cases are discussed, where brothers of the faculty read texts and attempt to reconcile theory with practice. There you find recipe books copied by students, marginalia noting the effects of a certain emetic, and debates about the temperament of particular patients. These debates are the precursors to a slow professionalisation of care. But across Europe and the Islamic world, the slow accretion of knowledge collides with the brutality of scarcity. Fuel shortages, poor hygiene, and the limits of human patience produce environments where charity and control generate both healing and harm. And so the medieval asylum, not an abstract institution, but a place of stone and wood, of ordered bells and ragged mattresses, of medicinal syrups and coarse bread, emerges in our reconstructions as the living organism of constraints. Its architecture sets limits on what can be done, its regimen attempts to humanize or discipline, its medical logic provides both methods and illusions. The sensory world inside, cold, stench, noise, is not simply a backdrop, it is part of the therapy and part of the punishment. The logistical details we reconstruct from plans, archaeological deposits, manuscripts and hospital ledgers reveal a domain of care regulated by funds and belief by clerical offices and by the grinding necessities of food and fuel. There is no single story of cruelty or compassion. There are rather layered histories in which a monk prays for a soul in a cramped cell, a barber surgeon bleeds a man in the hope of restoring balance, a keeper ties a strap to prevent harm, and an inmate hides a stale crust under a mat to eat later. Each act is mediated by the spaces in which it occurs and the logic that informs it. And when you view these places through the patient lens of a CGI reconstruction, when you pace the long ward and smell faintly, the fire's gone out and the herbs steeping in a brass cauldron, you begin to understand why the medieval asylum has remained a haunting figure in our collective imagination. It is where stone, faith, medicine, and municipal necessity come together to shape the fragile, often overlooked architecture of human dependency. When the bell of the priory tolled for the hour, and the light through the mullioned window fell in a pale, steady bar across the flagstones, those who tended the disturbed came to the chapel. The air there was always the same kind of thin and patient. A little of wax, a little of dust, a little of old incense that refused to go. A monk with a book at his hands, sometimes a parish priest, sometimes a bishop called for help, read aloud from pages that had been gathered and recopied across centuries. Prayers, litanies, exorcism formulas that claimed descent from the fathers and from ritual practice as old as Christendom itself. They were not, in the years between 1100 and 1500, idle theatrics. To the people who brought their raving, their silence, their convulsions, these rites were instruments of diagnosis as much as of cure, maps for deciding whether the affliction came from imbalance of humours or from something stranger and, to the medieval mind, more final, the possession of a soul. There was no single universal manual for such matters. There were points of reference. Burchard of Worms, at the beginning of the 11th century, gathered into his decretum a range of pastoral responses that bishops and abbots read when confronted with the unquiet. The Anglo-Saxon Lacnunga, knitted together in the same early medieval centuries, contained charms and prayers, odd little survivals of a vernacular piety that mixed Latin invocations with a kind of domestic magic, recipes to be tied on the body or written on lead and laid beneath a threshold. In the 12th century, Reginald of Durham compiled miracle tales of St. Cuthbert, whose cures, in the telling, solved torments now easily recognised as mental illness. Garbled speech smoothed to ordinary words, violence stilled in a single moment of touch by a relic. In the later 13th century, Thomas Aquinas wrote of demons and their possible possession in a tone that, though scholastic, left room for pastoral prudence. Possession was real, but rare. One read such things and then adjusted, parish by parish, case by case. The ritual itself could be as simple as a prayer and a sprinkling of water, or as elaborate as a public ceremony in the nave. Imagine a winter morning at Canterbury not long after 1170, when pilgrims still pressed to the martyr's shrine of Thomas Becket, bringing coins and candles and hope. The afflicted were led to the shrine on their knees, sometimes their feet red with the cold, their breath smoking in the air. The shrine glinted, silverwork, brightly gilded casket, the bones or objects said to belong to the saint. These were things that carried with them an authority the secular remedies did not. A canon would place a relic against the brow or the chest. The crowd would hold its breath as the priest intoned psalm and prayer, the sign of the cross marking out a kind of sacred geometry that might, the faithful believed, make the body hospitable again to the soul. There are many such miracle stories recorded in the decades after Becket's death, of a man with a wild mind who came to the grave and left walking straight. Whether the saint removed an invading spirit or whether the cold quiet of the shrine, the rhythm of the liturgy, and the visible compassion of those around him aligned long enough to steady him is a question historians argue about in books and footnotes. For contemporaries there was no sharp line. Relics were not merely objects of devotional viewing. They were working medicine. A splinter of wood, a fragment of bone, a cloth said to have touched a saint's skin. These were rubbed on sores, wrapped in linen and tied to the neck, placed beneath pillows. Their logic was dual. They invoked the saint's intercession, and they constituted, materially, a locus of power. The faithful would carry a reliquary to a patient's bedside with the same practicality with which a physician might apply a poultice. Shrines, for their part, became a part of the mental health economy. Pilgrimages, short local journeys in many cases, not long crusades, operated as rituals of penance and of cure. The route itself could be the therapy, the steady motion of walking, the requirement to confess, to chant, to sleep in the shelter of a community. Some hospitals and religious houses prescribed penances, fasting, vigils, repeated confession, on the logic that sin and spiritual disorder were sometimes the cause of physical disorder. The patient was asked to do what the patient could, to deny the flesh in order to coax the spirit back into quiet. It could be humiliating, it could be merciful. At the centre of this arrangement was a clerical judgment. In a parish of rural England, a priest might distinguish between melancholia, a word that was already used with medical seriousness to mean a humoral imbalance, too much black bile, and demonic possession. A bishop in a cathedral city had powers that the parish priest did not. He could delegate exorcists. He could read from episcopal rites that carried the weight of the church. But clergy were also physicians of the soul in a way that bled into medical practice. Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, who wrote both theological visions and physical remedies, treated disease as a confluence of bodily and spiritual forces. Practitioners trained in the medical schools of Salerno, Montpellier or Bologna read Avicenna and Galen and considered melancholia within a bodily framework. Diet, regimen, the balance of humours were their proper concern. Yet they did not always object to prayer and pilgrimage. Medicine and prayer rubbed shoulders in the hospital room like an uneasy couple. Rituals could be tender. There are quiet accounts of monks who, when confronted with a raving brother, sat with him, bathed him, changed his straw in his clothes, read the Psalms till his breathing slowed. The sacrament of confession, administered with humility, could function as a therapy. The unburdening of guilt brought peace to those whose despair had an ethical or social source. The church's care was materially real: shelter, warmth, salted meats when they could, straw bedding, a bed by the hearth. The patient could be fed and watched by a woman from the infirmary, a trained brother or sister whose work combined compassion and strictness. The monastic rule of St. Benedict, older than the medieval hospitals that later borrowed from it, commands hospitality for the sick and provides an ethic for care that led to the founding of many hospitals. A sick person must be treated as Christ himself. Those who lived inside these walls meant it, and yet rituals could be coercive. Miracle accounts sometimes read disturbingly when we allow contemporary eyes to see the cost. The same relic that could soothe might be thrust against a struggling mouth until the body stilled. Exorcism, when performed for the alleged presence of a demon, carried with it the logic of command, a voice of authority ordering the intruder out. The rite might include fasting imposed as a cure. Days without food can bring clarity. They can also bring collapse. When clergy believed that a guilt-laden soul invited demonic torment, the cure and the punishment blurred. Public penances, scourging, censure, and forced isolation were framed as therapeutic. Hagiography records both ends of the spectrum with little irony. A saint will be praised for binding and beating a tormented person into submission. Soon after, the saint prays and the man is made whole. Whether the binding was a medical restraint to prevent self-harm or a violent coercion meant to compel confession is seldom clearly separated in the sources. They are stories told to instruct. They are sermons dressed up as biography. Across these pastoral performances ran a shadow of social judgment. Women's ailings were often read through sexualized or moral lenses. Hysteria, fits of weeping, outbursts of language might be named as sin or as witchcraft. Men whose behaviour fell outside expected norms were sometimes labelled as diabolical. The clergy's diagnostic power could be deployed with justice or with cruelty. An honest pastoral to a poor woman who could not feed her children might be a blessing. A forced pilgrimage by a man whose relatives wanted his land might be a means of confiscation. The church's capacity to sequester was also an instrument of guardianship. And here the work of the monastic infirmary and its sister institutions shows all the complexities of medieval caregiving and medieval authority. After the prayers and the judgments, after the candles guttered and the reliquary was returned to its niche, there were the physical measures that answered the practical problem of a body that would not rest. If the spiritual regime was an overcoat of meaning placed upon the malady, this explains why, then the material regime of restraint was the blunt implement that prevented harm. Chains and collars, stocks and secluded cells were the tools by which safety and order were enforced in spaces where many believed the unruly body threatened both itself and the community. To think of these metal and wooden objects without sensation is to miss half the story. A link of iron is heavy when it is put down on a bench in a smithy. It is colder still on a winter morning when it bites into skin. The blacksmith, he could be a local artisan, or the castle smith called to the priory, made them with the technologies of the time, bar iron heated and bent, rivets hammered through, a collar forged to fit a neck. Reports and inventories from the later medieval centuries, when record-keeping becomes more frequent, show many hospitals carried such equipment. The language used is telling. Catena, vincula, manicula, terms that travel the same road as the Latin of liturgy. Some lists even note the presence of stocks, placed in the cloister yard for those whose violence was a nuisance to others. Other lists note girdles or collars kept in the dowry chest. The metalwork survives in museums as well. Later examples, better preserved, are displayed as relics of institutional care, their patina gleaming under modern lights. When a visitor gazes at such an object in a glass case in London or Paris, it is easy to imagine too quickly the worst, but the presence of an iron shackle in an inventory might as well indicate one of two things, protection or punishment. Often it was both. The medieval logic in favour of restraint is audible in medical and monastic texts. A violent patient, argued one medical tradition, needed quiet and immobilization so that the humours might settle. The Galenic tradition, imported from the Arabic physicians and taught in European universities, presented the body as a set of fluids in need of balance. Immobilizing a person who threw himself against his feathers and tore his bedding could be framed as a therapy. Hold him, remove the stimuli, quiet him so that the humours could be corrected by diet and regimen. The rule of St. Benedict allowed for restrictive measures for a brother who could not find obedience by other means. The aim was correction and eventual reintegration. Those who controlled the levers of care, priors, infirmarians, physicians, spoke of restraint with the soft rhetoric of safety. For his own good, they would say. It is a small but pernicious sentence, and it was often followed by the seal of the house. The boundary between protection and abuse was porous. Chains left on too long cut into skin, and the sores that developed were a second calamity for a body already teetering on exhaustion. Public instruments like stocks and pillories were used in town squares for punishment and spectacle. Those same forms were occasionally adapted inside hospital precincts to shame a patient into submission or to keep him quiet. The scold's bridle, a metal framework designed to silence the mouth, became infamously focused on women whose tongues were considered troublesome. While better documented examples of the brank belong to the early modern period, the broader practice of using muzzles or gags is ancient and medieval alike. Devices were sometimes improvised. Leather, rope, buckles bound to wrists and ankles. Sometimes they were purchased from the same craftsmen who bought pig iron and sold chains to the manor. The practicalities of manufacture and maintenance mattered. A chain had to be oiled, a hinge greased, a wooden stock replaced when it rotted. Such logistics are why the instrumental archive, receipts, inventories, the occasional invoice from a smith, remains one of the most direct windows we have into the material history of control. Museums allow a modern spectator to stand before these implements and to ask awkward questions. The Wellcome Collection in London, the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and other repositories hold tools and objects that belong to the longer history of institutional care. In a display case, the object is separated from its lived context. It is sanitized of usage. In the archive, however, an inventory list edged in medieval script names the same object and explains its place in a ledger. One iron chain for the lepers, pair of handcuffs for the violent, one stock for the yard. Pairing what we can see with what clerks recorded produces a denser picture. And when we add human testimony, rare in the medieval record but present in court petitions, in chronicles and in later centuries, in the lamentations of those who survived longer institutions, we get the moral dimension laid bare. A woman writing to a municipal magistrate in the later Middle Ages, claiming she had been confined unjustly, and that the bridle had made her talk like a mute, is a voice that reaches across time to the anonymous prisoner whose bone-deep hurt is only visible in the wear on an iron link. We hold the list and we hold the voice. We decide. Sequestration took architectural form as well. The medieval priory or hospital had places set aside for the contagious or the unruly, a cellar or infirmary off the cloister, sometimes an annex at the back of the garden, perhaps a tower room with a narrow window. In some towns there were dedicated houses for the mentally disturbed, structures distinct from both leprosaria and poorhouses, though these were rarer and often small. The Beald house in northern traditions could be a place of shelter, barely larger than a shed where a person might be kept. Monastic cloisters appropriated the spatial grammar of punishment and care. One aisle might be for the dying, another for the unwell, another for the solitary penitent. Solitude was therapeutic in the monastic imagination. Place a troubled soul in a small cell, give him the psalter, and with time and spiritual exercise the soul might come round. For others, solitude was a sentence. The closure of a window, the removal of company, the denial of bread beyond a minimal ration, such small things accumulate into an environment where hunger and isolation are harnessed, in the name of recovery or of order. And hunger is where the great crisis often began. Hospitals and almshouses possessed rights to gifts and endowments, but little regular income. They relied on the generosity of patrons and the bounty of the harvest. In rural parishes and in medieval cities alike, good seasons yielded enough grain for the poor and the sick. Bad years yielded scarcity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is a useful hinge for the historian's eye. Crop failures and cold rains hollowed out reserves, drove up grain prices, and left the poor close to starvation. Patients admitted during and after the famine carried bodies already depleted. They came with scrawny cheeks and hollowed eyes. Their immune system were compromised. Then came the plague of 1348, and the arithmetic of depletion showed harshly those who already lacked nourishment were the ones most likely to die. The diet inside the ward was modest at best. Many hospitals served pottage, thick soups of grain and vegetables, bread and perhaps ale. Meat was a luxury often saved for feast days or special alms. Milk was distributed when available, fish sometimes substituted on days of fasting. Endowments might specify a bowl of pottage and 2 loaves daily, for every poor man under the house's care. The charitable ritual of alms was not a substitute for a steady provisioning system. When alms failed, when the townsfolk themselves had nothing to give, the ward's stores dwindled. Chronic undernourishment made every other threat more lethal. Sanitation compounded the problem. A monastery that sat beside a spring or that had an elaborate drain, some Benedictine houses had remarkable waterworks, could manage to rid itself of waste more effectively than an urban hospital wedged between narrow lanes. The majority did not enjoy such fortune. Latrines were built where it made sense, near the outer walls, above open drains, or in rudimentary pits. Imagine straw-strewn wards. Bedding hardly ever changed in a hospital that had more mouths than money. Fleas, lice, and rats moving as casually between body and heap as merchants between stalls. The storage of grain or charity food in basement rooms. The use of the same hearth for patient meals and sickroom heats. All these practices allowed vermin and filth to become vectors. In that world, a patient could die of an infection caught from the straw beneath him or from the open sores produced by a chain. Secondary epidemics were frequent and mortal. Dysentery, a cluster of fevers we might call typhus, scurvy in populations deprived of fresh produce, and of course the bubonic plague were the sorts of visitors that turned hospitals into numbers on a town ledger. Contemporary observers recorded the arithmetic in the grieving way their means allowed. Boccaccio, writing in Florence in 1348, watched his city as hospitals filled and then failed. Bodies covered the streets. Neighbours closed doors and gave up the public rituals of care. Florence's Santa Maria Nuova, founded in the later 13th century and known for its communal charity, had the means and the civic support to be a centre of relief. But even it could not hold back a scourge that pushed well beyond human logistics. Burial registers, clerical accounts, municipal records and confraternity rolls give choruses of loss, name after name, candle after candle snuffed out. Historians reconstruct contagion from these registers. When the mortality in a hospital climbs above the rate for a city ward, when the same names or similar symptom descriptions recur in burial notes, one can see an outbreak in miniature. For most medieval institutions, however, the records are fragmentary and bitterly specific. An account for bread bought here, a payment to a gravedigger there, a ledger annotation, died, fever. From these scraps, scholars assemble patterns that show not only that the internal environment elevated the risk of death, but how the logistics of sustenance and disposal folded into that risk. Where there were too few gravediggers, bodies accumulated. Where the cellar was damp, mould attacked preserved foods. Where the infirmary's doors opened onto the market, contagion moved in with the crowds. Medical practice did not help as often as it could. Treatments deployed by trained physicians, phlebotomy, induced vomiting, emetics, the application of caustics were founded on received notions of bodily equilibrium. If a person was melancholic, let him fast. If he overflowed with mania, purge him. Sometimes these interventions restored a balance. Sometimes they removed the last bit of strength from an already emaciated body. More than one hospital ledger records purchases of leeches and cupping glasses beside sacks for straw. The logic was consistent: correct the humours, and the spirit will follow. It was, as modern readers might note, an eminently rational system given its premises. It was not often merciful toward the starving. This failure of supply and sanitation was not merely the consequence of accident. It was a question of organisation and scale. Many medieval hospitals were small houses serving a handful of recipients. A few, Hôtel Dieu in Paris and Bartholomew's in London, Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, became large and bureaucratic. These larger houses required steady endowments, a management of granaries, bread ovens, the hiring of servants, and the rule of a master who could keep the books. When a hospital became an instrument of civic pride, it often prospered. A wealthy benefactor endows a chapel, an annual rent is assigned for the purchase of meat, a guild donates bread. Where such structures did not exist, improvisation governed the daily life of care, and improvisation is fragile. Ships bringing in grain could be delayed by a storm. The poorhouse's charity could be overwhelmed by a city's poverty. The institutions that survived did so by an uneasy mixture of religious zeal, municipal oversight, and household thrift. Complaints accumulated. In municipal records, one finds citizens petitioning for the removal of a leper house from the town centre, or asking for better drainage near the infirmary. These requests sometimes forced reforms, new drains cut, new regulations for how to dispose of waste, but often they were slow and insufficient. The public perception of hospitals also varied. In some towns they were revered places of charity. In others they were blamed as sources of contagion, as sinks into which the town's disease fell. That ambivalence is a medieval version of a question we still ask. When does a protective measure become the very cause of harm? And even as the practical care contended with shortage and disease, small mercies continued. A sister would lay a plaster of herbs on a fevered brow, a brother would remove soiled bedding and replace it with a clean rush. A mass would be said for the dead and for their souls. The daily liturgy stitched a rhythm into the ward, matins, prime, terce, so that even the most troubled soul could count off a measure of time when much else had become indifferent. In the hush between the bells, between the scrape of a knife and the rustle of a sheet, caretakers and patients met in ways that did not always sort neatly into the categories of abuse and therapy. They were human moments of ordering and of disorder. A hand held, a bread crust shared, a patient turned to his side so he might not choke. If one imagines the medieval asylum as a single continuous place, one imagines wrongly. It was a scatter of responses rooted in theology, in medical theory, in local custom, and in material possibility. Some houses were generous and careful, their architecture facilitating drainage and fresh air. Others were cramped, badly supplied, and full of implements that scarred as much as they soothed. Sometimes the cleric's exorcism offered a genuine liberatory moment. Sometimes it was the first step in a sequence that ended with chains and isolation. Sometimes a skilled physician proposed diet and regimen that worked. Sometimes his bleeding and purging finished what the famine had begun. Often both the spiritual and the corporeal measures were applied to the same body, and the patient was buffeted by multiple narratives: sin and sickness, cure and control. There is a slow, grim humour in the historian's reading of these files, an irony of intention and outcome. Monasteries intended to be houses of charity and found themselves, through necessity and constraint, custodians of the ragged and the dangerous. Priests intended to free souls and ordained exorcisms that sometimes became performances of power. Chains forged for safety, cut skin, beds that sheltered the bereaved became the place where a contagion multiplied. The language of care and the language of containment overlapped, as if two footpaths had been built on top of one another, and neither had been fully worn away. As the Middle Ages slid toward modernity and the early modern institutions inherited these patterns, the long shadow of medieval practice persisted. Pilgrims seeking physical and mental cures still went to shrines. Relics still performed their ministrations. Chains gave way eventually to other modes of restraint and to professional structures of care. Yet the medieval strata remained. Belief in spiritual causation, belief in the powers of ritual, the cultural habit of confining the outcast, the chronic mismatch between charitable desire and logistical possibility. To sit with these facts is to sit with an old house that shelters many voices at once. In the last light before sleep, it is useful to remember both the tenderness and the constraint. The medieval hospital was not a single thing. It was a community's best attempt to answer questions for which it had partial knowledge and full compassion, partial knowledge about the body, full conviction about the soul, and a society's cumulative practices of restraint. The exorcist who read the prayer was not always a zealot. The smith who forged the chain was not always a cruel man. They acted from the materials, scriptures, hammers, bread, iron, at hand, and those materials shaped the kinds of mercy they could offer. Some were saved, many were not. So it was that ritual and relic, holding and halter, fasting and pottage, existed under the same roof. Each had a rationale and each a cost. Sometimes a man left the shrine steady in his limbs and grateful to God. Sometimes a woman left bound and small, ashamed at a penance pressed upon her for reasons no ledger would record. The medieval asylum, if that is the word we allow, was a place where the churches hoped to heal, the doctors hoped to cure, the town's need to protect, and the artisan's duty to supply iron all met. They met in chapel light and in the chill of the cell. They met in the rhythm of the psalms, and in the clanking, and in the hush of a ward where the smell of broth and the smell of fear braided into one. Listen, then, to the slow story told in these things. It is not a tidy tale of villains and victims, nor is it a legend of pure heroism. It is a house full of people doing what they could, given what they believed and what they had. There were saints and mistakes, miracles and wounds. If history is, as we tell it, a lamp held in the dark, then these chapters show a light that trembles and sometimes falters, but refuses to go out. Women were disproportionately committed for behaviours that transgressed gender norms, disobedience, sexual independence, widowhood or verbal outspokenness, and the manuscript's pleas and account rolls make that fact feel less like rumour and more like a pattern, deliberate and slow as a rope being frayed. In towns and manors from London to Lucca, from the river ports of the Low Countries to the parishes of Provence, the language used to justify confinement shifts and softens, but the motive does not. A woman who refused to remarry became, in the right phrases, sorrowful and disturbed. The unmarried daughter who kept company with a man of ill repute was said to be labouring under a melancholic distemper. A widow insisting on her jointure or pressing for an inheritance was described in a clerk's hand as imbecile of mind until she signed away what she had. These formulations are not mere accidents of diction. They are legal medicines, applied to the bodies and to property with equal care. The medieval world awarded women power and vulnerability in the same breath. Dowries, jointures, and dower rights made them visible as repositories of wealth. A dowry could be vast. It sat like a small island of value where marriage, mortality, and law met. Family strategists understood this. A troublesome wife, an outspoken sister, an independently minded widow, all these figures could be handily neutralised by one administrative act. Declaration of non compos mentis, or the simpler social alternative, enclosure in a convent or hospital. The convent offered respectable containment. The hospital offered a veneer of care. Both achieved the same legal effect in many cases. Someone else took custody of her person and her affairs. The records that survive are often petitions, smudged sheets where pleading and ledger entries meet. In a 15th century chancery bundle you can find a petition whose margins are filled with notes in different hands, pleas from kin to secure guardianship, a clerk's terse endorsement, and beneath it a witness's signature that reads, in the blunt Latin of local officials, testes jurati dicunt eam fuisse insaniam per spatium trium annorum. The jurors say she has been mad for 3 years. The woman's own voice, when it appears, is thinner, a letter scratched from behind bars or beneath a lock asking for release, for a hearing, for someone to check the excesses of the brother who now farms her meadow. The petitions are often polite, sometimes pleading and always careful to name a man to manage the woman's property. Legal language and personal circumstance braided together with a single aim. It is important to say gently that not every commitment was a scheme to seize land. Religiosity, shame, fear of contagion, actual illness and community safety all played roles. Yet the overlap between reputational risk and economic incentive is too large to ignore. A widow with a substantial jointure who refused to be controlled threatened not only the expectations of her family, but also the delicate balance of local alliances. One sees in municipal records a pattern of choices that privilege expediency. A conceded guardianship over a woman's lands for the good order of the house, or an admission into a hospital for her soul's health, while a male kinsman negotiated the future of the domain. Diagnosis too was gendered. Medical and spiritual ideas were elastic, they bent to social ends. Where a man's violent outburst might be recorded as mania or melancholia, with a brief reference to fever or humoral imbalance, a woman's same outburst often comes fitfully described as hysteria, lightness of the heart, or simply as immoderate speech. The canonical and learned texts of the period, from the glosses on Hippocrates to the opinions collected in university circles, provided a taxonomy that could be used in multiple ways. Clerical authorities quoted Augustine and medical writers quoted Galen, and both lists of authors could be called upon to turn social deviance into an illness that required enclosure and correction. A woman who was sexually independent, speaking openly of desire, refusing to be controlled, perhaps refusing to enter a particular marriage, could be labelled as morally suspect, and then, more conveniently, as medically unsound. Convents were, in this respect, double-edged instruments. They offered genuine refuge and spiritual vocation for many women who sought them, but they also served as repositories for socially inconvenient females. Families with an eye on inheritance could suggest the veil as both a proper cloister and a means of removing a claimant from the succession. The language used in monastic entry records betrays this ambivalence. Placed for devotion might mean what it says. It might also mean placed to prevent an inopportune marriage. When a noble family in northern France recorded the entry of a sister into a convent in the 1370s, the ledger lists a dowry paid and the goods given to the house, and the family's later accounts show the transfer of lands that had once been in her control. The convent obtained both money and social order. The woman's autonomy did not reappear in the county rolls. Cases where women actively resisted are revealing in their rarity and in their rhetoric. A defensive letter might plead for examination by the bishop, by physicians, by elders of the guild. The modes of resistance were legal, physical and rhetorical, protests to the archdeacon, petitions to the sheriff, a husband's public rebuke of the brother who had taken possession of his wife's chattels. But the machinery of medieval justice was not friendly to solitary women who fought back. Ecclesiastical courts favoured spiritual recalibration, penance, confession, prayer, while secular courts prioritised the management of property. When those two jurisdictions worked together, the result could be custody orders that were nearly impossible to overturn. Several kinds of evidence show how this worked in practice. The parish admonitions that call for a woman's seclusion, the municipal licences that allow a keeper to detain one who is raving, the household accounts listing the cost of her maintenance, with line items for straw, medicine, and a lock for the door. One particularly instructive set of documents comes from the municipal hospitals of northern Italian communes in the later 14th and early 15th centuries. Florence's hospital ledgers, the rolls of Santa Maria Nuova, founded in 1288, sometimes record the admission of donne d'ordine, women of the order, who were kept in a special ward with a custode. Payment sometimes came from the family in a single lump, sometimes as a rent charge on local land. Where the family paid, the record often notes whether the payment included a proviso, removal after a year, no sale of the woman's property, or a guarantee of guardianship. The small print of charity contracts matters. This legal medical choreography produced a predictable outcome. Women's complaints were more likely to be read as disease, men's as misadventure. The difference shaped bodies and estates alike. A woman who had been labelled melancholic might be given a regimen of bloodletting and herbs, then isolation. A man labelled lunatic might be placed under the watch of an uncle who was granted temporary custodial rights and the right to collect rents until the man's condition improved. In the second case, his legal identity remained. In the first, her voice was often erased. The cost of opening a case in chancery, of gathering witnesses for a jury of inquest, weighed on petitioners. Women with fewer independent resources were less likely to succeed. It is no accident that much of what we know about this gendered pattern comes from petitions, the bureaucratic residuum of private distress. They were written by those who could find a clerk, a patron, or a sympathetic official. The voices that slip through are often male. Husbands petitioning for custody of a wife's lands after committing her to a hospital, brothers defending their right to manage a sister's affairs for the good of the house, parish priests noting that a woman has been placed in a convent for the better conduct of her life. Rare are the notes in which a woman is the active petitioner, demanding her own release. When they do appear, they are usually stamped with the hand of someone else, an endorsement that qualifies their plea, and they are therefore fragile things, documents testifying to both resistance and constraint. There are, meanwhile, quieter injustices. Reputation was a currency in medieval life, and the mere suggestion of madness could ruin a woman's prospects for remarriage, for the good repute of her family, and for her own social participation. A woman shunted into an enclosure or hospital could be spoken of as behind locked doors, and thus no longer an actor within community governance. The irony was brutal. Institutions that claimed to preserve the moral order often deprived women of the very means they had to defend themselves legally and socially. The loss was not only physical, it was the loss of a voice in the negotiations that mattered most. The personnel who administered these practices, the monks, nuns, almoners, secular keepers and itinerant attendants, formed the second axis of this story, and their profiles tell us why charity and economy were inseparable in medieval caregiving. The medieval hospital was never a single monolithic thing. It could be a monastic infirmary attached to a priory, a municipal foundation funded by the commune, a private household room, or a church-affiliated hospice. In each of these places someone had to feed the bed, sweep the chamber, fetch the straw, collect the alms and decide when a person might leave. That someone was, in official terms, often the almoner or the infirmarian. In practice, it could be a laykeeper paid in coin or the shadow of favour. Monastic houses usually had internal officers for the sick. The infirmarian, infirmarius, oversaw the sick room and the distribution of basic medicine. The sacrist or almoner handled alms and the allocation of charity. The brethren and sisters did much of the daily care, praying and washing. Their work was governed by rules, statutes, confraternal statutes, or the constitutions of the hospital itself. Where monasteries were wealthy and the rules were scrupulously followed, one reads of ordered kitchens, controlled apothecaries and documented regimes of care. But monasteries were also subject to the same economic pressures as any other large household. They relied on rents from land, on the proceeds of corrodiers, the medieval grant of board and lodging, on the proceeds from chantry foundations, and on the seasonal generosity of donors. When those revenues fell, choices had to be made. Municipal hospitals and those founded by guilds or confraternities were different in structure but similar in temptation. A guild might establish an almshouse where a certain number of beds were assigned to its members or to the poor of the parish. The endowment might be a chapel, an acre of land, or a series of setzens paid into an account that would be drawn down each year. Municipal overseers kept account books. Their pages are a sober record of medieval arithmetic. One line will read the annual rent from Mr. John's acre, followed by payments for hay for the beasts, wages for the keeper, and bread for the hospital. These accounts reveal everyday decisions, whether to buy more straw, whether to hire a keeper for an extra 3 months, whether to accept a paying boarder who could bring coin to the house but might alter the balance for the truly destitute. The corrodies are a particularly revealing instrument. They were in effect income-producing contracts. A wealthy patron could buy the right to board, for themselves or for a named person, in a hospitable house for life. They provided steady revenue to the house, and this house in turn promised daily bread and a bed, sometimes the participation in liturgy. From the hospital's bookkeeping perspective, corrodies were gold. They converted a donor's capital into an annual annuity, and that predictable income allowed the institution to plan. But corrodies also crowded the beds. An institution could fill its limited space with corrodary beneficiaries who cost less than outsiders because their donations had set a rate, while those without corrodies had to be turned away or housed in less favourable conditions. Thus income shaped who received care and how attentive that care would be. There were also, in larger towns, secular keepers. These were people who undertook the supervision of an inmate for a fee. The shadow of such arrangements grows in the sources as the late Middle Ages progress. A well-off family might hire a keeper to live with, or to watch, a relative who was troubled. The keeper's earnings were sometimes supplemented by local alms, sometimes they were paid directly by the family. The keeper's job required stamina and, in certain cases, the willingness to restrain. Not infrequently, one reads in municipal complaints of keepers who absconded with a patient's plate or with funds. In other instances, keepers exploited their proximity to the house's stores. The economics drove behaviour. Pay was thin. Opportunity was present. Itinerant attendants formed a less structured, but no less important class. They travelled with noble households, they were summoned to manors when a relative's condition worsened, and they sometimes advertised their usefulness in local markets. Their services could be indispensable, A local lord would rather have a private attendant than call for municipal custody. But itinerant attendants were also unregulated. They could be better or worse than the institutional standard. There existed no formal licensing or standard training. In later centuries, such keepers would be sanctioned, licensed or prosecuted. In the medieval economy, they were part improviser, part caregiver, part arbiter of a family's fate. Account books and staffing records are, for the historian, mercy and indictment both. They show the cost of oatmeal, goat's milk, coal, wages for the keeper and the seamstress, and payments to the physician on particular feast days. They also show provisions for a place for one of the raving, with a set sum attached. The line items for ironwork, for an extra bolt on a door, for the hire of a mattress at the fair. In the municipal ledgers of Paris and Florence, in the roll calls of English hospitals, one sees budgets balanced against compassion. When a hospital took in paying guests, the books sometimes show the neat arithmetic. The paying guest contributed so many florins and covered the salary of the keeper. The poor man required board and medical herbs, and that had to be offset by the steady income. Charity became a budgetary category. The dark humour is that charity became, in medieval practice, a line in a ledger. This economic frame also explains violence and neglect where they occur. If the keeper's pay was low and if the institution depended on corrodies for reliability, the poor and the non-contributory could be left to the corners. If an official could lease a bed space or convert council to cash by lobbying the family to place a kinsman in the hospital, there was incentive to do so. Charitable intent was frequently sincere among donors and officers. It was also mediated by accountants and stewards. The desire to be seen as charitable, to have one's name carved on a hospital wall or embroidered on a confraternity cloth, placed reputational pressure on institutions and on those who ran them. The story of medieval caregiving is as much about piety as it is about balance sheets. Behind every ledger entry there were formal mechanisms of oversight, sometimes municipal, sometimes ecclesiastical. Bishops checked monastic rules, guilds audited their almshouses, city councils appointed masters and wardens, but oversight was uneven. Local politics intruded. The same mayor who would assure good care might also need to placate a powerful noble who sought custody of a relative. Where oversight was strong, contracts specified what an institution could charge and what it must provide. Where it was weak, the keeper's judgment carried the day, and the market's pressures did the rest. Finally, these social and economic realities intersected with law in ways that both protected and dispossessed the institutionalized. Medieval law provided routes to adjudicate sanity and to manage property, and those routes were often double-edged. The jurist Bracton, writing in mid-13th century England, made careful distinctions between the idiot and the lunatic, and between temporary lack of mind and permanent incapacity. Law recognised that someone not compos mentis could not responsibly contract, marry or manage an estate. That recognition created a duty of custodianship. The community or a court could appoint a guardian or conservator to look after a person's affairs. In theory, this was protection. In practice, it often meant dispossession. The mechanisms were familiar: a sheriff's inquest, sworn witnesses, a verdict of unsoundness, and the appointment of a guardian, a tutor or curator. The instruments were written in formulaic Latin, omnibus ad quos presentes litteri pervenerint, to all whom these present letters shall come, and then the facts, the jurors' attestations, and the assignment of custody. A sheriff's writ could order the seizure of rents from a man's domain to fund the guardian's care. A chancery commission might place land in the hands of a trustee. These are technical acts, bureaucratic and glacial, which is why they were so effective. Paper moves slowly, but it is hard to unmove. A man or woman could be declared incompetent in a single inquest and find their revenues collected and managed for years. Insofar as law offered redress, it was conditional. Appeals could be lodged, petitions written to the King's Chancery or to the bishop, but those venues required resources and a sponsor. Women, already disadvantaged in property and social power, had fewer options. A woman's appeal could be answered by a request for more witnesses, by an order to produce a surety, or by a simple deferral. Meanwhile, a guardian who controlled the revenue had immediate means to hire counsel and to maintain control. The juridical machinery favoured the controller. There were, nonetheless, moments when the law protected the vulnerable. Municipal ordinances sometimes forbade the sale of a lunatic's land without a court's consent. Ecclesiastical courts could order a guardian to account for revenues. The law could limit rapacity, but such protections required vigilance and competent officials. In many localities, that oversight was uneven, subject to local bargain and to the pressures of the ledger. Transcripts of hearings, the dry, studied voice of a clerk reading a verdict, show the ambivalence of the legal remedy. One typical inquisition might record the juror's oath, followed by witness testimony. She wanders at night and says that men have taken her goods. She eats and speaks not as she did. Her mind failed after the death of her husband. The verdict follows. We find that she is not of sound mind, and therefore William, son of Thomas, shall have custody of her person and the management of her lands until such time as she shall recover. Procedurally neat, practically devastating. The verdict protects against absentee claimants and fraudulent sales, but also hands the purse to a single man whose motives may be mixed. That ambivalence is the law's characteristic feature in this domain. It is a protective system that can be turned into an instrument of acquisition. The legal instruments used to strip or to shelter were not only the inquest and the guardian's writ. Letters patent, charters of custody, and municipal ordinances all combined to shape outcomes. A lord's escheator might step in where no guardian had been appointed. A sheriff might be paid to take the accounts. The language in many of these instruments is clinical and impersonal, a formal calm that belies human stories. To hold and to keep for the good and safe custody. Good and safe can become another way of saying out of the way. So the medieval asylum, or the broader network of hospitals, convents, private rooms and municipal houses that served as places of confinement, was at once a place of care and a place of social engineering. Gender determined how a crossing into that system felt. Economics determined who received attention and whose claims were shelved. Law provided the architecture by which people's personhood and property intersected. The result was a continent of small decisions, ledgers and decrees that together made up a civilization's approach to those it called lunatics, melancholics, the raving, and more quietly, the women whose speech or independence had been judged a risk. History keeps their records, the pages are pale with ink and with the pressure of fingers. If we read them calmly as one reads a ledger by candlelight, we hear both the compassion and the calculus. We hear the soft geometry of confinement tracked in columns, the steady arithmetic of loss. They come to us as petitions, as scraps, as the careful tallying of bread and ale in a monastery account book, as the thin, trembling hand of a woman on a will, promising a loaf or a candle to a hospital chapel, in return for prayers for a husband she had sent away. The voices are not loud. They arrive in ink, in the margin, in the terse Latin, or in the ragged English of a man who could not sign his name and made his mark instead, an X that seems to say everything. In these fragments the living world brushes the institutional, a payment to a keeper for watch, an order for a mattress, a complaint to a bishop that a son has been kept too long. Put together, slowly and patiently, the fragments shape persons, trajectories, and a grammar of confinement that is at once legal, domestic, clerical, and, sometimes, strangely humane. Consider first a reconstruction assembled from several documents scattered across the rolling parchment of a diocesan archive in southeast England, a petition dated to the 1320s from the parish of St Dunstan near Canterbury, an account roll from a nearby hospital, and a short testament that names a bed. From them we can imagine Alice of Canterbury, a wife who petitions the prior of St Mary for assistance in the management of her husband John, who had, she writes in the halting Middle English preserved by an able-handed scribe, been taken by fits and strange wanderings. John had not been a noble or a scholar. He had been a ploughman whose life was counted in oxen and seed. He likely began, as so many did, with fits that frightened his children, long periods of waking at night, conversations with voices that his neighbours swore they had not heard. The parish constable had hauled him to the edge of town when he wandered into the market at dawn and threatened the feed. In desperation, Alice turned to the hospital, not because she wanted to abandon him, but because the priory, with its infirmary and its chaplain, offered the form of care that family could no longer sustain alone. The hospital's account roll records payments of small sums, 2p a day for bread, a weekly ration of ale, straw for a pallet, and a token paid to a keeper. The keeper is an occupational ghost in these records called steward, watcher, custodian. His name may be given as John Fitz or Agnes's son, and his work is recorded in the same bland script that lists hay and candles. We read that a sling of herbs was purchased, a rue, wormwood, hyssop, and that a mass was to be said for the soul of John, who is frenzied. Months later there is a note, discharged. The later testament of Alice leaves one candle to the hospital where John was kept, a small specific piety that testifies to return, to survival, and to the continuing entwinement of household, hospital, and liturgy. John may have come home, or he may have been allowed to die in the hospital's care and to be buried in its cemetery, his name marked with a cross. Either way, the record insists that there was negotiation between family duty, charitable practice, and clerical custody, rather than an immediate and permanent sequestration. A different voice arrives from Flanders, stitched together from a Guild-minute book in Ghent, a municipal ordinance, and a plaintive letter to a magistrate in 1376. Here the protagonist is not a slow return to a wife's hearth, but an attempt at escape. Flemish towns were full of watchmen and municipal officers whose job, among other things, was to keep order when a person walked without reason. The town's watch was paid for bringing a man known as Allard, described in a municipal role as foul in speech and dangerous when riled, to the Hospital of the Holy Spirit. The hospital itself was an old labyrinthine place, a chapel, a refectory, narrow patient wards with dispersed straw and a courtyard where the sick could breathe. The account book lists a rope, for tying a window latch perhaps, and later a bill for repairs after Allard tore the shutter, free in the night, and climbed down into the alley. He fled. He was caught 5 days later near the river, bartering his meagre clothes for bread. There is a dry municipal admonition in the same volume, to guard the gates more strictly henceforth. The tale is comic, in the way a lost goat that stubbornly returns to the fold is comic, but it is also instructive. Escape was common enough to be an administrative problem. Watchmen and keepers were a persistent cost. Confinement was a practice that demanded labour and payment. Then there are the more affluent stories, where legal instruments and property converge. Across England and continental Europe, noble families used juridical devices to manage relatives whose faculties declined. The writ de lunatico inquirendo, a Latin phrase which translates to inquiry concerning a lunatic, was one of the legal tools that could be invoked to examine a person's capacity and to place their lands under guardianship. Take a composite case from northern Italy, where a merchant, Giovanni of Siena, falls into melancholia after a series of losses in trade around 1400. His family petitions the communal podestar to declare him non compos mentis, to appoint a guardian to protect the estate from waste. The municipal notary's record will preserve not only the finding of madness, but also a careful inventory. Chests of cloth held under lock and key, religious books, a small amount of coin, and 2 jars of distilled essences. The inventory reads like a human life rearranged as property. The private library becomes evidence. The presence of devotional images is cited as proof that the sufferer retains a measure of piety. The apothecary's potions are called into the pages as expenditure. The juridical framing matters. It is not simply the removal of a person, but an administrative balancing of rights, property, and responsibility. Women's voices complicate the picture further. Women were often at the heart of petitions, wives, mothers, sisters who sought protection or assistance for kin, and who sometimes used the hospital as a delicate intermediary. A Spanish conjugal conflict in Castile, recorded in the late 14th century, shows how gender and religious culture shaped the labelling of madness. A woman named Inés of Toledo, a reconstruction from wills and a short narrative in a municipal chronicle, wandered the streets speaking to saints and pulling off her shoes in church. Some declared her holy, a kind of sanctity that the Byzantines called holy folly, practised explicitly by those who renounced worldly ways. Others saw danger. 2 charitable bequests in nearby parish records show a split. One man leaves a sum to sustain ecclesiastical readings for Inés. Another leaves money to the hospital to ensure she is kept indoors. The tension shows how the community read the same behaviour differently, as spiritual insight, as social disorder, or as illness requiring custodial care. The outcome is not clear in the surviving record, and that uncertainty is itself revealing of how medieval communities made meaning from disruptive behaviours. Not all who entered these institutions did so under compulsion. Some came because they or their families sought refuge, a place where frail nerves might be soothed by prayer, by a daily ration, by the structured routines of the hospital. A small chronicle from Dijon notes, a poor man named Mathieu who, shaken by visions, sought the hospital's counsel. They gave him a bed, taught him prayer, and he was restored to the parish. Restoration sometimes meant reintegration into work, sometimes a quieting of symptoms, sometimes death. Mortuary rolls of medieval hospitals, where surviving lists show the dead of the year, removed to chapels and altars, include the names of those once described as imbeciles, an archival label that is modern readers' shorthand for a range of conditions. These men and women were not always chained in the romanticised manner we imagine. Often they received clothes, food and burial. The records emphasise routine: bread, beer, prayers, masses, and the administrative attention that kept these places functioning. The strain of survival in an age of plagues and famines made this attention both precarious and necessary. All of this is visible in the logistics: the keeper's wages, the straw, the herbs, the chaplain's fee for masses offered daily. The account rolls are litanies of provision. In an English infirmary roll of the later 14th century, many such rolls survive in fragments. A consistent pattern appears. Payment to the apothecary for sudorifics, purchase of woolen sheets, a regular allotment of beer. These are mundane traces of care, a diet intended both to sustain and to moderate behaviour, medicines that were as much emetics and purgatives as calming tonics, a regimen of prayer that aimed to address what clergy considered spiritual disorder. The scale of provision was never enough to transform the suffering of illness into comfort, and yet it is not absent. To think of medieval asylums only as draconian cages is to mistake caricature for evidence. Resistance found procedural expression. Petitions are the most eloquent chronicles of refusal, letters to priors, to bishops, to civic authorities pleading for release or pleading for continued custody, depending on who wrote. An elderly mother might petition the hospital for custody of her son because she feared the town's rough justice. A merchant's brother might press for guardianship because estate management demanded it. Suits in chancery and municipal records record appeals, the appointment of guardians, the seizure of rents, the inventories that followed inquests, administrative theatre that reveals the social stakes of mental disorder, property, honour, shame, the fear of scandal. The law is never neutral. It is a set of instruments through which families negotiated the public consequences of private misfortune. Escape, too, was part of the choreography. Watchmen were paid, gates were beaten, yet patients who fled were often simply finding themselves in the old world again, the streets, the markets, the riversides, and sometimes they returned to households that welcomed them back, patched up the ruptures with bread and labour, and let the old rhythms take hold. Death was recorded with a necrology entry, a short prayer, and perhaps the neatness of a stone marked by a cross. Recovery was often cautious and partial. Resistance could be ephemeral, an institutional recapture routine. But in these documents, the human agency is palpable. There are complaints, there are discharged patients, there are transfers between religious houses and private households, there are accounts that read like the everyday bookkeeping of a care economy. And then there are the stories of spectacle, a darker communal theatre in which madness was both feared and commodified, cherished and mocked, used to proclaim piety and to satisfy curiosity. From court jesters to carnival fools, from the illuminated margins of a psalter to the wooden stalls of a fair, madness was a public symbol, a figure that communities could display and interpret. The court fool was a paradox, licensed to speak truth to power while simultaneously embodying a tolerated social anomaly. Fools at princely courts in late medieval Europe, men and sometimes women who wore the cap and bells, were part of the social fabric and could offer criticism wrapped in wit. They were hired not to be locked away, but to be present, to be visible, to entertain and to instruct by inversion. The Feast of Fools, which took place with varying intensity across France and England between the 12th and 15th centuries, is an instructive example. For a day or several, the ordinary rites were parodied, lower clerics could mock their superiors, and sacred hierarchies were inverted. The day was risky. It was also, paradoxically, a ritual that contained a sanctioned period of irreverence. The communal performance of inversion was, at once, a social safety valve and a theatrical reenactment of the boundaries between order and chaos. It mattered to merchants and magistrates because it defined where normality ended and allowable disorder began. Public spectacles also took more gruesome forms. At fairs and in market towns, itinerant performers might show curious individuals for money. A man who spoke in tongues, a woman who lived in an animal-like fashion, a supposed mad hermit who dug in the earth. the late 15th century satirical book Das Narrenschiff, The Ship of Fools, published in 1494 by Sebastian Brandt, captured vividly how European readers understood a procession of folly, a raft of moral figures set adrift. The woodcuts accompanied moralistic text and invited readers to laugh at folly while admonishing themselves. The ship is an emblem of the period's ambivalence, pity and mockery, pedagogy and performance coexisting in a culture that often folded the stranger into its pedagogic frame. Charity sat at the centre of this theatre. Medieval hospitals, the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, the Ospedale di Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, the Heiliggeistspital in Nuremberg, and the priory infirmaries dotted across England were public displays of piety as much as sites of care. Rich donors endowed beds, chaplains, and daily masses in return for memorialization and salvation. Wills from the 14th and 15th centuries are full of bequests, to the poor of the parish, to the hospital for the mad and poor, to a chapel to be lit forever for the donor's soul. This ritualized charity produced a moral economy in which visible giving consolidated social positions. A named bed in a hospital chapel was an instrument of remembrance and social prestige. The donor's portrait might be painted in a window, his armorial shield fixed on a plaque, his name recited annually. Charity thus produced both comfort for the afflicted and spiritual currency for the benefactor. But that currency could also become commerce. The medieval world had private keepers who took in the problematic for a fee, household accounts that list payments for keeping my sister who is strange, and municipal edicts that assigned responsibility for wandering madmen to families rather than to the commune. Over time, and especially later into the early modern era, the exchange of money for custody hardened into a market dynamic where private madhouses proliferated, and the poor, desperate or disruptive found themselves in paid care whose standards depended on profit. In the later medieval century we see incipient evidence of commodification, payments to private keepers, fees for admission to hospital wards, and the sale of curiosities that included human oddities. The line between charitable care and commercial exploitation was porous and shifted with the pressures of urban growth, plague, and fiscal necessity. Visual culture amplified these tensions. The margins of illuminated manuscripts, look for instance at the Ludlow Psalter or the Luttrell Psalter from England, teem with grotesques, fools, and hybrid creatures that make folly visible and laughable. Illustrations functioned as moral commentaries but also as mnemonic devices. A fool's cap in ink beside a landed knight warned readers of the perils of pride. The iconography fed popular imagination and in turn shaped how communities recognised, mocked, and sometimes cared for the mad. When panels of the late medieval world show a chained figure, it is all too easy to assume uniform practice. But images are rhetorical. They register fear and moral lesson as much as they describe daily reality. The law too performed in public. Civic ordinances often tried to regulate who might beg in the street, who might be forced to go home, and who might be placed under supervision. The English Statute of Labourers of 1351, enacted in the wake of the Black Death to stabilise wages and restrain movement, also had implications for itinerant beggars who blurred with those judged mad. City watchmen gained instruction to remove vagrants and ensure they were returned to their place of domicile. In Burgundian cities and Italian communes, similar municipal statutes sought to regulate the presence of outsiders and the management of the insane who could no longer be kept within the private household. These ordinances were rarely compassionate in the modern sense. They were practical instruments aimed at regulating labour, protecting property, and maintaining public order. The spectacle of madness, then, was also a governance problem. A community had to decide whether to hide, to display, to punish, or to support. When we turn to memory and misconception, the narratives we have inherited are stubborn. We imagine chained bodies and dark, windowless rooms. We see Bedlam as a symbol of universal medieval brutality and assume an unbroken line from medieval confinement to the asylum industrial complexes of the 19th century. Michel Foucault's sweeping account in Madness and Civilization wrote a compelling, influential story about the Great Confinement and the birth of modern psychiatry. His work reframed our questions and revealed how the Enlightenment narrativized exclusion. But subsequent historians have been careful to complicate that sweep. The medieval record is not a simple prelude to the stark totalities of later centuries. It is variegated, an edgeland of hospitals attached to religious charity, A household economy where families managed problematic kin, municipal ordinances that attempted regulation, popular culture that both mocked and incorporated folly, and legal mechanisms that apportioned custody and caretaking. Archaeology supports the nuance. Excavations at hospital sites in cities such as London, Cambridge and Siena have revealed wards with light, evidence of herb beds, domestic pottery and graves arranged by order rather than in anonymous pits. These are not necessarily comfortable spaces, but neither are they invariably the archetypal chains and darkness cells of later imagination. Archival evidence of purchases, wax for candles and soap for washing, a need for straw bedding, is consistent with a kind of basic institutional care that involved liturgy, food, and some attention to cleaning and comfort. Where restraints appear in the record, they do so as one response among several, sometimes medical, sometimes punitive, sometimes practical. Chains did exist, so did mattresses, prayer books, and small luxuries. The medieval patterns mattered to what came after. Charitable hospitals became models for state or municipal forms of care. Gifts left in wills for the perpetual lighting of a chapel in a hospital would, in time, become the foundation stones for institutions that in the early modern period took on larger custodial functions. The juridical apparatus that defined incapacity, inventories, guardianships, inquests, hardened into later legal practices that would regulate the property and rights of those deemed lunatic. The cultural scripts of folly, the fool's cap, the carnival inversion, the moralistic satire of the ship of fools, carried forward images that would be exploited and amplified by print culture into the 17th and 18th centuries, sometimes to the cost of dignity for actual patients. So how should we tell these stories? Carefully, with ethics and craft. First, name the sources and be transparent about reconstruction. When we breathe life into a person from a will or a ledger, say so. This is a composite, a reconstruction, a life suggested by the documents rather than laid out in full. Second, avoid anachronism. Resist the urge to diagnose modern disorders into medieval behaviours. The cultures that interpreted fits, melancholy or tirades were theological, humoral and legal in ways that cannot be mapped directly onto modern psychiatry. Third, put agency back into the narrative. Patients, families, keepers and clerics all acted. Recognising agency interrupts the comforting narrative of total victimhood. Fourth, resist spectacle. Do not turn suffering into voyeuristic entertainment. Convey sensory detail and material conditions without titillation. Fifth, listen for what the record cannot say, the pauses, the blank margins, and treat those as meaningful silences. These silences tell us about shame, about lost voices, about the ways communities try to forget what they had done. Finally, and most urgently, recover these histories because they shape contemporary debates. When modern societies argue about the rights of people with mental illness, about institutional care and community provision, about compulsory treatment, they invoke legacies that run deep. The medieval world teaches us that communities have always confronted the delicate balance between care and control, charity and commerce, public order and individual dignity. Remembering the particularity of that past, its practices, its compromises, its contradictions, equips us to question our present certainties. It urges us toward policies that prioritize consent, community support and human dignity, rather than defaulting to isolation or spectacle. In the quiet hours when the lantern is down to its stub and the scribe has closed his book, the voices still insist. They are not simply data. They are persons who petitioned, who escaped, who recovered, who died, whose straw was paid for in a hospital roll and whose names were whispered into a bell tower's ear. The work of the historian, and the duty of the storyteller, is to keep them distinct from the myth, to show both the architecture of systems, legal, clerical, civic, and the fragile human agency within them. In doing so, we do not sentimentalize, we do not exonerate. We render complexity because it matters. Those scraps of parchment are the last witnesses of lives that mattered then and matter now. They ask that we resist the comfort of caricature and sit with the sober, slow truth of what institutions did, how communities negotiated, and why. Across centuries, the shadow of the medieval asylum still falls upon our debates about care, rights, and remembrance.